On June 16, even as the U.S. 2nd Division was locked in the battle for Belleau Wood, the New York Times headlined the news that 1 million American troops would have arrived in France by July. So far, only a handful of the Doughboys had participated in actual combat, but their moment was fast approaching. The mighty German assaults on the Allies, beginning in March and continuing into June, had failed to force a decision. But the German High Command remained tuned to the offensive. During June and early July the Germans gathered themselves for one final effort to end the war with the Friedensturm, or peace offensives. Initially, 3 armies would improve the German position in the Marne salient by pushing the French from the area around Reims. Following this success, General Erich von Ludendorff intended to launch a decisive attack against the British in Flanders. This time, however, Ludendorff would not enjoy the advantage of surprise. The Allies anticipated another attack. Prisoners soon revealed the details, the date, July 15, and even the exact hour. The French prepared a defense in depth. East of Reims, the U.S. 42nd Division was brought in to stiffen the French front line. But the main U.S. participation would be by the U.S. 3rd Division and elements of the 28th Division along the Marne River line just east of Château-Thierry. The 3rd Division had been in place since mid-June, conducting patrols and digging in. The 28th had come in during the first week of July. When the United States 3rd Division took up its positions on the Marne, the French were positively pitiful in their state of nervous tension. We were given orders to speak to French officers and men only in the most optimistic terms. They said, "We are war-worn and war-weary." When asked, "Are you beaten?" almost invariably their God-given spirit responded, "Oh no, but we are very tired." Acting on their intelligence coup, the French opened up on enemy lines with an artillery barrage at 11:45 p.m., less than a half an hour before the German assault was to begin. Shortly after midnight, the Germans replied, and at 1:10 a.m. 2 German divisions, the 10th and the 36th, launched pontoon boats and started across the Marne River toward the Americans. The French defenders ran. The Doughboys stayed put, dug in along the river and a railway embankment parallel to the Marne. The German artillery had our trench cold, the place was full of passed away and wounded. 3 direct hits had accounted for 15. I was so frightened myself, I could scarcely get the men together. One sergeant, cool as a cucumber, came up and gave me an immense sense of help. There were 3 or 4 maniacs from shell shock whom we had to overpower. We dug some of the poor devils out and started them up the hill. The faint sounds and stirrings in the caved-in banks were terrible. Some we could not reach in time and one of these was smothered. We had one party of wounded all together and started up the hill at once, when a big shell fell right in their midst. I saw men blown into the air. Awful confusion again. The state of a wounded man, wounded again, and still under fire, is beyond description. Private Joseph D. Engel, 2 other men and myself were on outpost when the German drive started. Engel mistook some Germans for Frenchmen and went out to talk to them. Before that, I wanted to shoot, but he said, "Don't shoot, they are French." Engel said something to them which I could not hear, discovered his mistake and shot down one of the Germans. They fired and he groaned and fell. He didn't struggle. We fired and the Germans ran. I crawled out to Engel and felt his pulse and listened to his heart and found no signs of life. We fell back and the Germans took the ground. The fog and the smoke were clearing. Directly in front of us and down by the railroad I could see German infantrymen, wearing overcoats, coming straight toward us in approach formation, similar to that used by our army. As they approached up the hill, they dropped out of sight until they drew close to us. The German infantry and machine gunners came on at a slow walk, as steadily as though on a drill ground. An officer at the head of them was swinging a walking stick. They were not hindered by artillery or machine gun fire. Because of B Company stragglers coming across our front and because I judged it would be more effective to hold our fire, we waited until the Germans came as close as the British did at Bunker Hill, perhaps 30 yards, being more or less on different parts of the line. Near the center, 2 Germans were down on their knees. My impression at the time was that they were cutting our wire, but that could have hardly been the case, as they could have easily stepped over it. Presumably, they were getting a light machine gun ready for business. I gave the order to fire, battle sights. One of our men near the center called out, "Don't shoot, they are Company B men." I answered back, "They are Germans, commence firing." They did a good job of it all along the line. The man next to me, and I do not know who he was, quietly said, "Lieutenant, I am hit. May I go to the rear?" The breast of his coat was torn by a bullet. The automatic rifle squads were making their chow-chats rattle like machine guns. The 2 Germans in the front were conspicuous and drew an undue amount of the first burst of fire. They were riddled instantly, and time and again afterwards did I overhear different men of the platoon say that they knew they had eliminated at least 2, as they described what happened to the kneeling men. Every man who fired at them seemed to be convinced that he eliminated them and to be unconscious of the firing done by others. Lieutenant Mercer M. Phillips, in command of my first platoon to meet the shock from the forward edge of the railway bank, had been superficially wounded in the head. Corporal Del Soldato was trying to dress it when a charge came over the top. Phillips seized Del Soldato's rifle and bayoneted a Prussian officer 5 times through the body, and then this officer, with a supreme effort, steadied his hand by pressing his elbow on the ground and in his passed-away gasp shot Phillips, who stood 6 feet 4.5, through the brain. One of my men, the littlest chap in the U.S. Army, it will always be a mystery how he got in, was a peculiar combination of insect, fowl and fish. He wore a disorganized expression of material calamity. The loose perplexity of unemployment. He was a fixture in the awkward squad, and I tried every known system to get him out, discharged. He was with us, but never of us. He didn't belong, but here he was, even in France, drawing his breath, rations and 75 per. Sometime during the morning of July 15th, while the fighting was at its fever heat, I heard a vigorous, at my side. I looked down when I had time and saw this lion-hearted little recruit coolly removing a beautiful Luger automatic in its holster from the body of a Prussian officer he had just bayoneted. Later a staff colonel asked me for a pistol of that kind. I remembered the above incident and asked this quiet little hero if he would like to give his Luger to the colonel. He said, "Yes," and handed it over. I said, "No, you give it to him yourself." I wanted him to have the honor, although I well knew the tongue-tied embarrassment of a modest private in the presence of royalty. He delivered the pistol without a word, and the colonel, to express his appreciation and make a pleasant remark, said, "Did you eliminated him?" Replied the tongue-tied private, "Did I eliminated him?" By nightfall, it was clear that the German offensive had failed. Lieutenant Kurt Hesse, a member of the 5th Grenadiers, which had been overwhelmed by heavy fire by the 3rd Division Doughboys, recalled, "I have never seen so many passed away, never have I seen such a frightful scene of conflict." On the other bank, the Americans, in close combat, had completely overrun 2 of our companies. Lying down in the wheat, they had allowed our troops to approach and then completely overrun them by fire at a range of 30 to 50 paces. This enemy was cold-hearted, this was already recognized, but this day he gave proof of a bestial harshness. "The Americans eliminated everyone," was the cry of fear on July 15th, and which for a long time, caused our men to remain deeply shaken. That night the German survivors began withdrawing back across the river. The next morning, Lieutenant Frank Glendenning and I took some men and went back to the 4th Platoon trench. We took shelter halves and blankets and went through the ditch and recovered personal effects and remaining items. Some things we just turned under, and the most we laid to rest in a great shell hole. Then we pulled out the men that were trapped beneath debris in the dirt. Some were severely damaged by the explosive debris and could not be recovered intact. Lieutenant John Quinn, a Pittsburgh boy, who had just got his commission a week before, was so mixed up with the 2 men who had lain nearest to him that I do not know yet whether we got things just right. But we made 3 resting places, and laid them to rest in a very well-marked position, 1 man on each side of the lieutenant, just as they had fell. A Catholic priest, one of our chaplains, came and said a few words, some of the boys knelt and it was all over. I got Quinn's watch, which was still going, and gave it to his brother a few weeks later on. We did not feel this so much at the time. Trying to get the identification tags is the worst, but you get numbed after a while. The failure of the offensive across the Marne River concluded 4 months of offensive action by the German army. The end result was an enemy salient some 37 miles in length along the base, from 6 miles west of Soissons to just west of Reims, and about 20 miles deep, bulging out to the US 3D Division sector at Château-Thierry on the Marne. With the Germans now on the defensive, General Foch prepared a counterstroke. The target was the western face of the enemy bulge near Soissons. A penetration here would force the Germans to evacuate the salient at the very least, and possibly even trap sizable forces at the tip of the bulge. To lead the attack, the French chose the US 1st and 2nd Divisions, both in reserve below the Marne River and brought up to full strength since the fighting in May and June. The two brawny divisions, each twice the strength of a French or German division, would launch a surprise attack at Soissons, going in on either side of the French 1st Moroccan Division, and what was left of the French Foreign Legion, the best troops the French had left. On the night of July 17 to 18, the doughboys were hustled forward along forest trails toward the jump-off line amid a flurry of last-minute confusion. We hastily loaded into trucks, and after a hectic all-night ride, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines was dumped off in the edge of a large forest and told to take cover. There for the first time we had intimation that an attack was coming up. Lieutenant James Legendre, our battalion adjutant, arrived with notes and parts of a French directive. Legendre spoke French like a native, sort of with his tonsils. One does not note the precise day of the attack, he translated. As easily as though reading English. He rattled on to that part dealing with pyrotechnics. A yellow smoke from an airplane signifies that a counterattack is coming. A green caterpillar from the ground will direct the airplane to have the artillery lengthen the barrage. Captain Lester Wass jerked his head up from the helmet he had been using as a pillow. "We don't have caterpillars, green or any other color," he protested. "As a matter of fact, we don't even have very lights." Legendre scratched his head for a perplexed moment and then brightened into a grin. "Well," he shrugged, "we probably won't have any airplanes either, so what's the difference?" The orders were brief and businesslike. Major Ralph Kaiser knelt in the gathering dusk before the only map available in our whole battalion. The rest of us crowded in close, hoping to get some idea of where we were and where the fight was going to take place. Being the junior officer present, I didn't rate much of a view. From my position I couldn't see the hachures on the map well enough to tell a hill from a valley. As it was, by standing on tiptoe and stretching my neck, I could barely distinguish a large blotch of woods under Major Kaiser's finger. Major Kaiser paused while we scribbled notes. Then, without looking up, he continued, "1 officer and 20 men from each company will be left behind." In the silence following that statement I asked a question. It was more for the relief of saying something than to get information. "I only have 160 men now, Major. Why leave any behind?" Major Kaiser's eyes remained on the map as he answered my query. "They will be needed as a nucleus to build new companies after the attack." Well, I got what I had asked for and wished I had kept my mouth shut. So did everybody else. I ran into the CO of the Foreign Legion Battalion which was to jump off on our right. He was a big, fierce-looking French officer with a big black mustache and wore a croix de guerre with a long ribbon stretching almost from his shoulder to his waist, on which there were so many palm leaves that it was hard to count them. He was going over his area also. He gave me a drink of their eau de vie, which was white lightning, and about 120 proof. Their eau de vie, which was white lightning, and about 120 proof. We had a nice visit and he said he hoped it would be sunny on the morrow, as it was much better weather for killing Germans, and that he was looking forward to it. He looked as if he meant it, too. I confess I was not too keen about it, and had some misgivings as to what the next day held. This proved to be the commandant's last hunt, however, for he was killed the next morning just about the same time I was wounded. We sat there and waited. Waiting around is the worst part. When you know you're going over next day, it sure does make you think back. You wonder about everybody you ever done a wrong to, and you don't hardly say a word to anybody. You don't seem to recognize anybody. I hardly seen them, and that's a fact. You're sort of walking in your sleep. Then every so often you begin to figure, well, what'll we find over there in the enemy's lines? And also, what'll they do to me if they catch me? That waiting around before you go over always gets my goat. Gee, it makes me nervous. After I get started it is different, but that waiting around sure gets on a guy's nerves. It makes your mouth dry. Everybody kept asking, "What time is it?" They would ask it 1,000 times. Graham came to me very much upset. He had lost his Croix de Guerre ribbon, which he had worn all during the conflict. He had been with the French prior to our entry and considered this loss an omen of ill luck. I had never seen him so disturbed before. He said he had a hunch that the Germans had his number this time, and now he was sure of it. He wasn't cold, but his lips were blue and his teeth were chattering. I was very much worried because I had charged him with maintenance of our direction during the offensive and couldn't talk him out of his state of mind. He did have the right hunch. I was not near him when he met his fate, but was told afterwards that the top of his head was severed by machine gun bullets, and his passing away was of course instantaneous. Graham and I had become great friends. He was a man of about my age and had done quite a bit of civil engineering in South America. He loved music and his favorite tune was "Poor Butterfly." Every time I hear that tune now, it recalls sadness instead of pleasure, and it takes me back again to Graham and the wheat field south of Soissons on that hot summer day of July 18, 1918. We hadn't reached the trenches yet, and morning wasn't far off. We were right ahead of the artillery positions, and that meant we must be 6 or 7 kilometers behind the front lines. Artillery was always that far off. I took out a cigarette and struck a match, and before I could even light it, the nearest officer lammed it out of my hand. "Cut that out," he ordered, "we're going over the top in 2 minutes." Well, I thought he must be kidding, and so did the others that heard him. There was mists hanging low down close to the ground, but it was a right pretty day, too nice a day to fall. The country was rough and a hard one to fight over, plenty of woods and wheat fields, and there was stone quarries, too, all full of Germans. The wheat stood as high as your waist in the fields. Waiting for 0 hour within a stone's throw of the German lines was a nerve-wracking experience. There was desultory artillery and machine gun fire during the night by both sides. As dawn approached and the enemy front line could be dimly seen, a figure appeared on the skyline in the familiar outline of the squat helmet of the German soldier. At first he appeared to be engaging in some weird calisthenics, bending and twisting about with his arms working like flails. As visibility increased, we saw that he was mending the barbed wire in front of his trench, working rapidly to complete his task before daylight. At 4:30 our artillery preparation cut loose with a roar, and the German wiremender disappeared in a shower of dirt, broken timbers, stakes and wire as the shells shattered the Boche emplacements. The artillery barrage continued for 5 minutes and then shifted back to the enemy support positions. Our whistles shrilled the "Follow me" signal of the infantry, and the Marne offensive was underway. The new men of my company conducted themselves splendidly. Lacking the caution of the old-timers, they crossed fire-swept areas without hesitation. I don't believe they recognized the buzz of rifle and machine gun bullets for what it really was. We moved forward at a slow pace, keeping perfect lines. Men were being mowed down like wheat. A whiz-bang, high-explosive shell hit on my right, and an automatic team which was there a moment ago disappeared, while men on the right and left were armless, legless, or tearing at their faces. We continued to advance until about 50 yards from the woods, when something hit me and I spun around and hit flat. I didn't know where I was hit, so I jumped up to go forward again, but fell. I crawled to a shell hole nearby. I don't see how I ever got there, as the ground was being plowed by machine guns. I heard later that my company had 1 officer and 29 men left when we reached the objective. We had gone to this sector with 8 officers and 250 men. Our boys were going forward in waves across the wheat fields, one line about 10 or 20 paces behind the other. They were walking slow and held their rifles at the firing from the hip position. They had pretty good distance, too, about 5 paces apart. Sometimes there would be a gap before you seen how, then another man from the rank behind stepped up to fill the place. In 5 minutes I seen one man move up from the 4th line to the 1st. I was in the 4th wave. The first 2 waves are much better than the others. After going over for about 600 yards and about 100 yards from a small town which was one of our objectives, I received my wound when 2 big shrapnel shells exploded beside the squad I was in, receiving it in my leg. The next fellow got his left hand blown off, the next was shell-shocked and lost his voice, and so on. I could use all the paper in the Y telling how each of us got wounded or killed. It sure is horrible. It is something that is impossible to express, but there is something humorous about it, as when we just started over, a high explosive shell lit right behind one fellow on my right, and as you know, most of the power of a shell goes before it, so in this case, it didn't hurt the fellow, but just raised him off the ground about 3 feet, then turning around, he said, "That one sure had whiskers." The same fellow had his bayonet taken away by a large shell. I particularly remember one wounded German. He was hitching along the ground, trying to get under cover, and he was in bad shape. One of our men drew a bead on him, but another of our chaps knocked his gun sideways and yelled, "Save your ammunition. He's done for, anyhow." But the thing that sticks in my memory is that I couldn't hear a word of it, although I was right up close when he yelled. I must have read his lips, that's the kind of noise it was. I encountered a major of the 23rd Infantry. I attached myself to him for a short time, but he was very rattled. He only had 1 or 2 runners, had completely lost control over his battalion and did not, in fact, know where his own troops were. Isolated platoons were attacking the ravine on the right, but there seemed no control nor liaison by regimental or battalion commanders. It was a case of the enlisted men and platoon leaders continuing forward with utmost bravery, with the higher officers incapable of controlling them. These platoon leaders were inexperienced, had no maps, did not know exactly what was expected of them, and isolated groups of enlisted men were wandering around asking only to be led, completely at a loss as to what they should do next. We received orders to advanced to join the front line, and took off on the run. We heard what we thought were sparrows chirping, and something that sounded like a .22 rifle cracking. The chirps were bullets whizzing past, and the closest one sounded like .22 shots. Those low bullets cut the wheat, folded it down, and made lanes through the field that looked as though someone had drawn lines across it. We had about 1 hour of rest, if it could be called that. The Germans kept up a sweeping fire through the wheat. A friend named Dick had dug in about 3 feet to my right and kept telling me to dig deeper, or my butt would catch a bullet. I said, "Yeah, buddy, better keep your head down." He was looking at me when the funniest expression came across his face, which seemed to elongate about 3 inches, then blood was trickling down his face. A bullet had hit his helmet and gone through his head. Ahead of me our boys kept on going. A lot of men went down, but the lines never stopped. I would see a man walking across the fields with his rifle at his hip, and suddenly he would take another step and there wouldn't be no step there, and he would go down. Some fell flat, some grabbed at their wounds and sort of crumpled down, and some would sit down slow like they were sitting down in a chair. I don't remember ever seeing a man throw up his personal effects and fall back. Maybe that's because they are moving forward and they've got the weight of the rifle and bayonet in front. I passed a lot of passed away and wounded. It was terrible to hear the wounded moaning and crying, "First aid! First aid! First aid men here!" We soon were out of the wheat field. the infantry advanced by short rushes. As I moved forward, a half-dozen infantrymen would get behind me in Indian file so that my body would protect them from German machine gun bullets. If I swung to the left, they would swing behind me to the left. If I went to the right, they would swing behind me to the right. All of a sudden the ground opened up unexpectedly in front of me. There was a trench there, nobody was in it. It was deserted, I had to jump down into it. But first I wanted to drop my machine gun ammunition, which felt heavy on my left shoulder. It didn't take but a second to ease the strap off my shoulder, but it was just 1 second too long. A 1-pound device came along with my number on it. It hit the machine gun I had on my right shoulder and jolted me, lifting me briefly off the ground, and I didn't know what was happening until I came down again. I landed in an awkward sort of way with my feet off the ground. My right arm had somehow gotten caught between the wall of the trench and the lattice work, and there I hung, all at once. Not so good. I tried to move my arm loose. I was kind of rattled, but I still had enough of my wits to know that I was in a tricky situation and that I had better get out of it quickly. The wall of the trench had shifted with me, and a rock had pinned my arm. I tried every way to get it loose. There wasn't any way I could budge that rock. Then I began to notice my arm felt numb. Now I realized it had been scratched and bruised. My fingers were hurt and dangling slightly. A gash ran through my wrist, and just above the wrist my arm had been scratched. Not much, but a little skin held it together. Another scratch affected my forearm, up as far as I could see, but it didn't hurt any. There just wasn't much feeling in it. It made me feel a bit uneasy to look at it. I mean, when I thought of it and remembered it was my own arm. The way it was affected, I had to act quickly or I'd be in trouble. Hanging, I could see the tops of 8 helmets, coming bobbing along the main trench. In one way I was in an ideal position. Jogging along as they were, they couldn't very well see me before they rounded the corner of the trench into my part of it. I took out my gun with my left hand and waited for them. It seemed like it took them an awful long time to get there. The pressure of the rock on my arm seemed to help stop the bleeding, but it was trickling and dripping down the lattice the whole time. Finally they drew into sight, still on the run, and I fired, catching them at a disadvantage that way. I stopped 4 before they even knew where the shots were coming from. The other 4 who were left raised their hands and began to yell, "Kamerad." They were armed with rifles, and they didn't have any explosives, so I motioned to them to put down their guns and then motioned to come near. They did. One was a big tall man, 6'2" at least, with a medal on his tunic. Another was a youngster, maybe 20, and the other 2 were 30 or older, and one wore glasses, sort of like an owl. All their uniforms were neat and tidy, and they looked combed and brushed and sort of out of place. They stared at me wide-eyed. I had to straddle one leg across to the other side of the trench, to ease off the strain a little, and I could see them thinking what fools they were to give in to any guy who was hung. I motioned them with the gun to come up and help me get my arm out. The rock would not budge. They strained and heaved, but it was no use. They could not move it with their bare hands, and I would not let them get hold of any of the timber laying around for fear they would overpower me. I was losing strength far too fast and could not go on. There was only one thing to do, and I did it. I made the 4 prisoners back off a little ways and stand where I could see them. I laid the automatic in a handy place. Then I pulled my buelo knife and got a good grip on it with my left hand, settled my right elbow solid on the parapet and swung the buelo down with a quick clean motion. My arm came free and I landed down on my feet with the automatic. A sort of haze came over me, but just for a second. I had them covered and they were staring as though they had seen a ghost. With my left hand I whipped off my belt, made a loop out of it and got it over my arm, and then with a piece of stick through the buckle I twisted it until the flow slowed to a trickle. The boys had seen something of what had happened. They saw me make the run with my machine gun and saw the shell strike me. After that they did not see any more of me and they gave me up. They figured I had fallen. Then suddenly I came popping up with 4 Heine prisoners. They yelled their heads off. We were receiving enemy fire on both flanks. The most severe fire, however, was coming from guns south of the Kravenken farm. These guns were in the lane of the Foreign Legion. While I was trying to find out where this fire was coming from, something hit me on the shoulder and knocked me down on my back. It felt as if I had been struck by a heavy object. I got to my feet, but my left shoulder was numb. I thought I had been hit by explosive debris as shells were falling also, but could see no sign of injury, and then I collapsed again. This time I could hardly breathe and was carried into a shell hole by a sergeant and a private whose names I do not know to this day. Before I passed out I remember that the hole was a great big one, and sitting across from me was a passed-away German. He had no helmet but wore that funny little round cap on his head. He was a brunette and his sightless black eyes were looking right at me. We were running across a field and that is the last I remember. When I came to the sun was high in the sky. I tried to get up but could not. My combat pack was full of holes, my rifle was broken, I crawled over in a shell hole, my nose and ears were bleeding, fluids ran from my mouth, I thought I was about to pass away, shells were bursting everywhere, that screeching sound was fierce, there were hundreds of wounded going back, I yelled for help, then I crawled out of the shell hole and started back to headquarters on my hands and knees. Alba and Trindad came back looking for me, they found me crawling along. Gee, kid, I thought you had fallen, we left you for passed away, the shell lit about 3 feet alongside of you, it knocked me down, we got up and saw you still laying there. At the field hospital I saw Joe Humbler, he was suffering terribly, he passed away in my arms. Saw Bill Sweeney, he was injured in the leg, when he was going up to the front line I wished him good luck and God bless you and he said the same to me. Well, says Bill, we'll get a nice rest now. Anyhow, the field hospital was in a big cave and was full of wounded and the moaning was painful. Private Vance came in with half a jaw severely damaged. Keeler, from Cleveland Plain Dealer, was injured in the arm. I'll get a fine rest now, he says. Later, Sweeney, Keeler and myself left the cave to go back and find an ambulance. Keeler ran after a truck and got on. A shell hit right in the center of the truck and neutralized 7 and took Keeler's arm clean off. 2 other wounded boys came by and I asked for help. One of them got me a branch of a tree for a crutch and we got going to the rear. Beaurepaire farm was in much confusion. The courtyard, the tables, the outside of the farm were full of wounded. There had been no efficient provision made for taking care of our wounded. There were no ambulances, only one doctor, a battalion surgeon from the 9th Infantry, was there and he was totally incapable of taking care of 1/10 of the number of wounded at the farm. The rest of the medical officers had established their headquarters unintelligently so far to the rear that the wounded could not be gotten there. The 9th Infantry doctor there soon got in such a state from overwork that he was practically useless. Many men were passing away from lack of attention. I remember particularly one wounded German officer. He was lying propped up against the wall of the courtyard. He was evidently in some pain for he would wince from time to time gritting his teeth. He was very good looking, smartly dressed even in the midst of battle. He seemed aristocratic to his fingertips, though owing to the many American wounded little attention could be paid to him he did not complain. I hope he survived. Some of the men appeared interested in their wounds, some paid no attention to them, while others were horrified and wanted to pass away. I remember one fellow who attempted a self-inflicted act but the piece of shell that had crippled him had broken his revolver too. Boys with shattered legs begged their comrades to eliminate them. I shall always remember how they pleaded. We passed one such in an advance one morning and returned that night by a different route. When we went up the same place the next morning we found this same soldier passed away with a projectile wound to the head, but we never knew whether it was self-inflicted or whether some German patrol neutralized him in the night. During that afternoon, to my surprise, there appeared over the hill to our right a detachment of French cavalry. They were a beautiful sight. The horses shining and well groomed. The cavalrymen had nothing much else to do for 4 years but groom their horses. They were splendid animals with long arching tails, and not at all like the scrubby half-starved beasts which we had to pull our guns. Each man was carrying a long lance, which seemed a most extraordinary weapon for modern warfare and brought back the memory of the pitched charges of Napoleon's day. The cavalry disappeared on the trot over the hillside in a gentle cloud of dust, and I did not see them again. However, I heard the next day that as they trotted towards the German lines machine guns opened up and that soon that weapon of modern warfare completely disorganized man and beast and they hastily retreated to the rear, to again, I suppose, groom their horses and shine up their lances for the rest of the war. Later, both the French and Germans would comment on the elan displayed by the doughboys as they advanced stubbornly against the enemy machine guns, but the doughboys had paid a terrible price for this praise. One battalion of the 16th Infantry lost all its officers and half its men fighting around the village of Chowdun, ending up under the command of a wounded sergeant. as night fell, the wounded and passed away of both sides remained littered about in the wheat. The battlefield was very quiet, there was no firing going on in the vicinity, all the guns were silent, evidently in the process of being moved into new positions to take up the battle again in the morning. It was very dark, though the stars were shining bright. It was a pitiful walk through the wheat field, the ground was full of fallen figures, and on hearing my footsteps, the air became full of the calls of the wounded, in French, in English and in German. An old Frenchman, he looked at least 50, in a tattered blue uniform was walking slowly down the road carrying on his back, towards the dressing station, a wounded American doughboy. Every time I have felt annoyed since then at France, this picture comes to mind and my anger softens. I will never forget that walk back through those wheat fields. All along I heard groans, cries for help in English, in French, in German, pleas for water and babblings of delirious men. All the way back, the fields were full of passed away and passing away and nothing could be done for them. When we left this sector a week later the fields were still full of American passed away, officers and men. Several good friends of mine among them, our regimental chaplain did wonders in getting a good many of them laid to rest, but there were too many to handle. The fighting resumed the next day as the exhausted doughboys somehow found the determination to continue. By July 19 the 2nd Division had established itself just short of the Soissons-Château-Thierry highway. The division was relieved that night by a French division. The doughboys and Marines had driven the enemy back 6 miles, captured 3,000 prisoners and 75 guns. They suffered 4,000 casualties in the process, including 750 passed away. The 1st Division remained in action until the night of July 22 after bitter fighting for the town of Berzy-le-Sissi. That town had originally been the objective of a French division that failed to capture it after several attempts, relieved the night of July 22. The Big Red One had advanced 7 miles, captured 3,500 prisoners and 68 guns from 7 different German divisions. Its own losses were horrendous, about 6,900 officers and men, including nearly 2,000 passed away. What was left of E Company marched in single file from the railroad crossing to the Bois de Retz. It was dark, we were not shelled, and I was more tired than I have ever been. The men were subdued, perhaps more exhausted than I because they carried more equipment. I announced there would be no reveille and gave that order to the bugler. I told the company to lie down where they were and go to sleep. That met with instant approval. The next thing I knew was that someone was kicking me in the ribs. I said, "What the hell are you kicking me for?" It was the bugler and he sounded off reveille. I told you there would be no reveille, and he kicked me again, motioning to his left. I looked, there was the 1st Division Commander General, Charles P. Summerall. He had come alone to express to us his appreciation for the accomplishments of the 18th Infantry in the Battle of Soissons. Standing in a semicircle, we listened to the general, then we went back to sleep. I am sure that General Summerall made a good speech, but I am also sure that none of us remembered a word of it. Passing through Vierzy, there was a spot in the road where a large German shell had evidently fallen 3 days before, and there were half a dozen Marine passed away, still lying scattered about there, all wearing their gas masks, probably to go through the acrid smoke caused by very heavy shell fire, above the ravine, where our artillery battery was. Between it and Vauxcastel, I found the bodies of 2 23rd Infantry officers, evidently neutralized, leading their troops towards the ravine where the Germans held up our advance for a couple of hours in the middle of the day of July 18. One of the lieutenants, Ken Fuller, I recognized, for I had known him in Harvard where he was in the class below me. It was a peculiar thing, but the German passed away nearly always were in grotesque positions, with personal effects and legs spread out, while the American and French passed away seemed to have just crouched down on the ground and stayed there. Perhaps this was owing to the fact that the Allied soldiers were advancing and leaning forward when they were neutralized, while the Germans were probably standing still or backing up. Not a scent was found on the bodies of any American passed away. Their pockets had always been rifled and their belongings scattered on the ground near their bodies. The Moroccan division, including the Foreign Legion who had been on our left, were tough and brave fighters, but they evidently felt that money was of no use to a passed-away man and had wandered into the adjoining sector and taken all there was to take from the bodies. Our troops are doing fine work. They gave the Hun the hard knock of the last few days. The success in this particular has a very good effect materially and psychologically. The spirit of everyone is away up. This is what we wanted. The French and all the Allies now take off their hats to the American fighting man. We can well be proud of him. This may be the turning of the tide. Dear Brownie, I'm a very lucky hombre. Went over the top at 8:20 a.m., July 18th. High explosive shell hit the road alongside of me and never touched me. The gas blinded and choked me and I fell into a shallow dugout alongside the road. Just then the dugout was blown up and the last of my sensations was of floating up, minus my left leg. Some time later, when I got back to Earth, a hospital apprentice assured me I was all there. Considering all this, I'm feeling pretty good. I've been to the land from which only cooks and chaplains return. And I've got all my personal effects. Why? I don't know unless God and our country has further use for me before the Kaiser puts my address on a shell. An English Tommy told me before I went up to the battlefront that if I were lucky my trials and troubles would end the first day, and were I extremely out of luck, I'd duck along for a year or two. I smiled incredulously then. But he was right. I believe that if it is ever necessary for me again to endure what the last 17 days have battered in and out of me, I should be a raving maniac.